Rebecca Doyle's hands had stopped bleeding an hour ago. Not because the wounds had healed, but because the cold had killed the feeling entirely. She was pulling a broken cart through 3 feet of Montana snow with 6 children strapped behind her in everything they owned, and her youngest boy had just gone silent. Not asleep. Silent. She turned around and saw him sitting in the drift with his eyes half closed and something in her chest cracked open like frozen ground under a wagon wheel. She did not scream. She could not afford to. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Every comment, every city, it means the world. Now stay with me, because what happens next on that frozen road is going to change the way you think about strength, about love, and about what it truly means to survive. The cart had one good wheel left. Rebecca had known since sundown, when the left rear wheel cracked against a half-buried stone on the side of the Helena Road, that she was pulling dead weight through the storm. But she kept pulling anyway, because stopping meant sitting down, and sitting down meant thinking. And thinking meant remembering that 3 days ago she'd had a home, and now she had nothing but 6 children and a broken cart, and a road that went on forever into the white dark. "Mama?" That was Clara, her oldest girl, 11 years old, and carrying her baby sister against her chest with both arms locked tight. Mama Thomas stopped. Rebecca turned. Thomas was 7. He was the quiet one, the one who never complained, the one who had held his father's hand at the funeral without making a sound, while all his brothers and sisters broke apart around him. He was sitting in the snow beside the road, with his eyes going glassy, and he wasn't shivering anymore. That was the thing that stopped Rebecca's heart. A child shivering is a child still fighting. A child who stops shivering has given up the fight. She dropped the cart handle and plowed back through the snow to him, dropping to her knees, grabbing his face in both her hands. "Thomas. Thomas, look at me right now." His eyes drifted up to hers. "I'm just resting, Mama." "You don't rest in the snow, baby. You hear me? You don't rest in the snow." She pulled him against her, wrapping both arms around him, trying to give him every degree of warmth she had left in her body, which wasn't much. "Can you stand up for me? Can you do that?" "My legs are heavy." "I know. Mine too." She pressed her lips to the top of his head, and she felt how cold his wool cap was, how the fabric had soaked through from the snow. She looked up at her other children standing in a row behind her. Clara with the baby, then 9-year-old Daniel with his jaw set the way his father's jaw used to set, then the twins, Ruth and May, holding each other's hands, and at the end, little Joseph, 5 years old, whose boots had come apart at the seam 2 miles back, and who was walking on rags now. "I need all of you to come in close, right now. Body heat. Come on." They piled against her without a word. That was the thing about her children that broke her and rebuilt her at the same time. They never argued with her anymore. Not since the bankmen came. Not since the letter from the county about the trailer. They just did what she said because she was the only solid thing left in their world, and they were all holding on. She felt Thomas's chest begin to rise and fall a little faster. She felt Clara's arms tighten around the baby. She felt Daniel's shoulder press into her back, steady and warm and stubborn, exactly like his father. William Doyle. Dead. 14 months crushed in a collapse 300 feet underground in a copper mine that the company swore was safe, that the company swore had been inspected, that the company had settled for $3,000 and a printed letter of condolence signed by a man who'd never once set foot in the mine. $3,000, after the funeral, after the debts. After the lawyers her brother-in-law Richard had recommended and steered toward, she now understood, there had been nothing left but the trailer and the 6 children and a grocery cart she'd found behind the church. And now she didn't even have the trailer. "Mama," Daniel said quietly, "there's a light." She lifted her head. Down the road, she couldn't tell how far, because the snow swallowed distance the way it swallowed sound. There was the faint amber glow of a lantern. Moving, swaying, coming toward them. Clara took a step back. "Is it them?" Is it the county men? Stay close to me. Rebecca stood up, bringing Thomas with her, hooking one arm under his knees and lifting him against her chest. He was heavy for 7. She'd always kept her children well fed, when she could, even when it meant she went without, and Thomas had her husband's bone structure broad and solid. She adjusted his weight against her hip and planted her feet and watched the lantern come closer. It wasn't a wagon. It was a horse. One horse moving slow through the drifts, and on its back, a shape that resolved slowly out of the dark into a man, broad-shouldered, head down against the wind, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He didn't look like a county man. County men came in pairs and drove wagons with the seal on the side. This man came alone. He pulled the horse up about 10 yards away and sat there for a moment without speaking, just looking at them. Rebecca could feel her children crowding in behind her. She could feel Clara's hand grip the back of her coat. Then the man said in a voice as low and rough as gravel, shifting under ice, "How long you been out here?" "Long enough," Rebecca said. She kept her chin up. She had learned the hard way, the humiliating way across 14 months of loss, that the first thing people saw when they looked at her was her size, and the first assumption they made was that her size meant weakness. She was not weak. She had been pulling a broken cart through a blizzard for 4 hours with 6 children behind her. She was the opposite of weak. "We're fine." The man looked at Thomas hanging limp against her chest, half asleep. He looked at Joseph's wrapped feet. He looked at the baby against Clara's chest, the baby who had been silent for the last hour, in the way that babies go silent when they have cried everything they have. "You're not fine," he said. Not unkind, just flat. Like a man stating a fact about the weather. "Where are you going?" "Helena." "Helena's 11 miles. Rebecca said nothing, because she'd known it was 11 miles, and she'd started walking anyway, and she wasn't going to apologize for that. The man looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't see his face clearly, the hat, the dark, the snow between them, but she could feel the weight of his attention, the way it moved across her children one by one and came back to her. Then he said, "Come with me, now." Clara's hand tightened on her coat. Daniel moved up to stand beside her. "Mama, I heard him," Rebecca said quietly. She looked at the man on the horse. She looked at Thomas in her arms, whose lips had gone from pink to the particular pale gray that she knew from the night her husband had been carried out of the mine. She looked at Joseph's feet. She made the only decision a mother could make. "My children come with me," she said. "All 6 of them. That's not negotiable." The man said, "I counted 6. She studied his face as he swung down from the horse in one smooth motion, and for the first time she could see him clearly. Lean somewhere around 30, dark-eyed under that wide hat brim, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week, wearing a coat that had been good once and had been worked hard since. He moved without waste. Every motion deliberate. He was the kind of man who'd learned a long time ago to conserve energy in hard conditions. He walked to her without rushing and held out his arms for Thomas. And something in the directness of it. No performance, no speech. Just here. "Let me carry the boy," made her hand. Thomas over before she'd consciously decided to. The man took the boy with the ease of someone who'd carried weight, before settled him against his chest, the same way she had, and walked back to his horse. "Name's Elias Mercer," he said, lifting Thomas into the saddle. "My ranch is 2 miles. You walk faster than I ride. We'll get there the same time." Rebecca picked up the cart handle. "Rebecca Doyle." He nodded once. "Mrs. Doyle." Then he clucked to the horse and started walking, and Rebecca walked alongside him, and her children fell in behind her, and nobody said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying. That was the first thing she noticed about Elias Mercer. He didn't fill silence. Most men she'd known filled silence, because silence made them uncomfortable, because silence meant they might have to sit with something they didn't want to sit with. Elias walked through the storm with his horse and a strange woman's child in his saddle and said nothing at all, and it wasn't the silence of a cold man. It was the silence of a man who'd been emptied out, and hadn't yet decided what to fill himself back up with. The ranch came out of the snow like something imagined. First the fence line, then the dark shape of a main house, then the long, low shadow of a bunkhouse set back from it, and everywhere the smell of cattle and hay and wood smoke. It was not a grand spread. The house needed paint, and the gatepost leaned, and there were tools rusted against the fence that had been there long enough to become part of the landscape. But the barn was solid, and the smoke from the main chimney was thick and real, and Rebecca felt her youngest children break into a half-run toward the warmth of it, without anyone telling them to. Elias carried Thomas inside the bunkhouse, which was one long room with 6 rope beds and a stove that he lit, while Rebecca stripped Thomas's wet clothing and wrapped him in a wool blanket she found folded on one of the beds. Clara got the baby down and held her close to the building heat. Daniel pulled the twins in with him. Joseph fell asleep sitting up before the stove had warmed the room. When Thomas's color came back when he opened his eyes and looked at Rebecca and said in the aggrieved voice of a 7-year-old who has decided the crisis is over, "I'm hungry." Rebecca sat back on her heels and pressed both hands over her mouth and breathed. She did not cry. She had trained herself out of crying in front of her children months ago, because when she cried, they looked the way children look when the person holding the world together starts to let it slip, and she could not do that to them. So she breathed. She pressed her hands over her mouth, and she breathed through the shaking in her chest until it passed. When she lowered her hands, Elias was standing in the doorway, holding a covered pot. He set it on top of the stove without comment. Beef stew from the smell of it, thick and real, the kind made from something that had actually lived and not from a tin. He produced a stack of tin bowls from somewhere outside her line of sight and set them beside it, and then straightened up and looked at her. "There's enough for all of them," he said. "What about you?" "I ate." She wanted to push back on that. It had the sound of a lie. The kind of small lie people tell to make others feel less like a burden. But her children were already moving toward the pot with the focused energy of the genuinely hungry, and this was not the moment for her pride. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and turned to go. "Mr. Mercer?" He stopped. She stood up and squared herself to look at him directly, because she had found that meeting things directly, even hard things, even frightening things, hurt less than flinching. "I'll be honest with you. I don't know what this is. I don't know what you expect from bringing us here, and I want to be clear before another minute passes, that I'm not—" She stopped, found the plainest way to say it. "I'm not that kind of woman. I'm a widow with 6 children and nothing to offer, and I'm not looking for anything except a place to get warm tonight, and tomorrow we'll be on our way." Elias looked at her for a moment. His expression didn't change, that same quiet flatness like standing water. "There's no expectation," he said. "Stay as long as you need." "That's not how the world works, Mr. Mercer. People don't do something for nothing." "I'm not people," he said, and walked out. She stood in the doorway watching him cross toward the main house through the snow, and she tried to find the angle, the calculation, the thing he was getting out of this, and she couldn't find it. Which didn't mean it wasn't there. It meant she hadn't found it yet. She went back to her children. For 3 days they stayed in the bunkhouse, and the world outside didn't know they were there. Elias brought food twice a day and left it at the door. He did not come in unless Rebecca invited him. He did not speak to the children beyond a nod. He rose before dawn and worked until dark, and didn't appear to notice that 6 strangers were eating his food and sleeping in his bunkhouse. On the 4th day, her oldest son Daniel went to find him. Rebecca only found out about it afterward when Daniel came back with his jaw set in that stubborn way and told her, "I asked him if I could help with the fence work. He said yes." "Daniel, we can't just eat his food and do nothing, Mama. That ain't right." She couldn't argue with that because it wasn't right, and she'd raised him to know it. "What did he say exactly?" "He handed me a hammer." Daniel paused. "And then he showed me what to do. He didn't talk much, but he showed me everything." She found out later that the twins had followed Daniel out to the fence line and stood watching until Elias, without looking up from his work, handed Ruth a pair of leather gloves. And that was how it started. Not with any declaration, not with any conversation about terms or arrangement, but with a hammer handed to a boy, and a pair of gloves handed to a girl, and the quiet practical work of survival, creating its own kind of gravity between people who needed each other without knowing how to say so. The town knew within a week. Rebecca heard it first from the woman who ran the dry goods in Helena, a Mrs. Alderman, sharp-faced and sharp-eyed, who looked Rebecca up and down when she came in to ask about credit, and said in a voice designed to carry, "You're the one staying out at the Mercer place, with all those children." A pause that meant more than the pause. "By yourself." Rebecca kept her eyes on the woman's face. "That's right." "People are talking, Mrs. Doyle." "People can talk," Rebecca said. "I'd like to know about credit if you don't mind." Mrs. Alderman didn't give her credit. She told her very politely that the store didn't extend credit to women without a man's signature, which was the polite way of saying what she actually meant, which was something uglier and something Rebecca had heard before in other voices and other words. She walked back out into the street, carrying the weight of it, and stood in the cold for a moment with her eyes on the mountain line. She was used to being looked at. She had been looked at her whole life, first as a girl who grew too big too fast, then as a young woman who never quite fit into the shape the world seemed to want women to be, then as a wife and mother whose body kept changing and expanding with each pregnancy and never quite returned to wherever it had started. She knew the vocabulary of that kind of looking. She knew the quick cutaway of polite disgust and the long examining stare of the ruder sort, and the way people's voices changed when they addressed her, going either too careful or too dismissive, never quite managing to land on the register they used with women whose bodies met whatever standard they were measuring against that day. She walked back to the ranch in the cold and did not stop. It was Elias who noticed when she came in to bring him the wool she'd been repairing in the bunkhouse. The children had found his mending basket ignored in a corner, and Rebecca had taken it on without asking and looked at her face for a moment before looking away. "Helena give you trouble," he said. "Nothing I haven't handled before." He was working at the table with a piece of harness leather. He didn't look up. "Mrs. Alderman," among others. A silence. Then, "She's been talking about this ranch since my wife died. She's got opinions about how a man should conduct himself after a loss. I've never paid her much mind." He paused. "You don't have to either." "I know that," Rebecca said. "It still lands." He looked up then, and for a moment she saw something move behind his eyes. Not pity, which she couldn't have stood, but recognition. The particular recognition of someone who knows what it is to be talked about by people who don't know anything. "It does," he said simply. "It does land." That evening, he left food at the bunkhouse door as usual, but this time there was also a small wrapped parcel. Inside it was a length of deep brown wool fabric, good quality enough for a dress. No note, no explanation. She stood holding it for a long time. She did not thank him that night. She couldn't find words that wouldn't come out wrong, that wouldn't sound like more than she meant, or less than she felt. She folded the fabric carefully and put it away, and the next morning she got up before the children and walked to the main house and knocked. Elias opened the door with a coffee cup in his hand and a look of mild surprise. "I need to know what you want," Rebecca said. "Not in the way I asked before. I mean, what do you actually want? From this arrangement? From us being here? Because I've been here 4 days, and you keep leaving things at my door, and you're teaching my son to work fence, and I cannot keep accepting without knowing what this is." He looked at her for a long time. The cold air came between them. "My wife's name was Catherine," he said finally. "My daughter was 4 years old. Her name was Alice." He looked at the coffee in his cup. "They died 2 years ago. House fire. I was in Helena." He stopped. "I've been alone here since." Rebecca was quiet. "I don't want anything from you, Mrs. Doyle," he said. "I saw a woman who needed help and children who were going to die in the snow if I rode past. That's all it was." He looked up. "But I'll be honest with you in return. This ranch has been dying since Catherine died because I stopped caring about keeping it alive. Having your boy out on the fence line, it's the first time in 2 years I've worked alongside someone." He stopped again. "That's worth something to me. If that's an exchange you can accept." Rebecca looked at him for a moment. "It is," she said. She went back to the bunkhouse. She sat down on the edge of her bed while her children were still sleeping, and she held the wool fabric in her hands, and she allowed herself 30 seconds of something she hadn't permitted in 14 months. The thought that things might possibly somehow become something other than what they were right now. 30 seconds. Then she folded it away again and got up to start the day. She did not know yet that a letter had already been sent from Helena to a lawyer's office in Cheyenne. She did not know yet that her brother-in-law, Richard Doyle, had been looking for her since the week after the bank took the trailer. She did not know yet that the land in Wyoming she'd inherited from her husband's grandmother land. She'd never once thought about land she'd forgotten existed, sat above mineral deposits that a mining surveyor had quietly valued at more money than Rebecca Doyle had ever been able to imagine. She did not know that Richard knew, that he'd known for months, that the lawyers were already moving. She only knew that her youngest son had color in his cheeks again, and that her oldest daughter had laughed that morning for the first time since the funeral, and that outside the bunkhouse window, she could hear Daniel and Elias working the fence line in the gray Montana morning, the hammer strikes coming steady and even through the cold air, a sound like something being put back together. She picked up her mending. She listened to the hammer. She breathed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Rebecca didn't know about it until Wednesday evening, when Elias came to the bunkhouse door and stood there with an envelope in his hand, and a look on his face she hadn't seen before, something tight around the jaw, something carefully controlled behind his eyes. "This came for you," he said. "Addressed to me, but your name's inside." She took it. The return address was a law firm in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The name at the top was Caldwell and Pierce Attorneys at Law. She'd never heard of them. She read the letter twice standing in the doorway, and the second time she read it, her hands went very still. "What is it?" Clara asked from inside. "Nothing, baby. Keep eating." She looked up at Elias. "My brother-in-law, Richard Doyle." "I know the name." She looked at him sharply. "How?" "He came through Helena about a month before I found you on the road, asking around about a woman with 6 children and a broken grocery cart. Asking if anyone had seen you." He paused. "I heard about it from the man who runs the livery. Didn't think much of it at the time." Rebecca looked back at the letter. "He wants the children. Says he's filing for guardianship on the grounds that I am." She read the exact words because she wanted to say them out loud, because she'd found that saying ugly things out loud made them smaller. An unfit mother, by reason of physical incapacity, mental instability following bereavement, and inability to provide adequate housing, nutrition, or moral environment. The words sat in the cold air between them. "Physical incapacity," Elias said. "He means my weight." Elias said nothing for a moment. Then, "You carried a child 4 miles through a blizzard. I know what I did. The court won't care what I did. The court will care what I look like, and where I live, and whether I can produce a roof over their heads that belongs to me." She folded the letter back into the envelope. "He doesn't want the children, Mr. Mercer. Richard Doyle has never once in his life wanted something that wasn't worth something. So the question I'm asking myself right now is what he thinks my children are worth." She went back inside and closed the door, and she sat down at the small table and thought about it for a long time while her children slept around her, and the answer came to her at 2 in the morning, with the particular clarity that comes when the mind finally stops fighting what it already knows. The land. William's grandmother's land in Wyoming. She'd never done anything with it, never seen it, never thought about it after the lawyer read the will, because William was dead, and there were debts and children to feed, and she hadn't had the time or the resources to think about land she'd never seen in a state she'd never visited. But William had filed the transfer. Her name was on the deed, and if there was something underneath that land, she got up. She dressed in the dark. She walked across to the main house and knocked until Elias opened the door, which took 3 knocks and a full minute, and he opened it in his work shirt and suspenders, with the look of a man prepared for either emergency or annoyance, and ready to meet whichever it was. "Do you know a man named Harper?" she said. "Joseph Harper. He's a land surveyor, works out of Billings." Elias's expression changed. "I know who he is. Was he in this valley in the fall surveying—" A pause. long enough to tell her something. He was, Elias said. He was out on the old Doyle land in Wyoming, the abandoned section south of the Powder River Basin. He looked at her steadily. Mrs. Doyle, there have been rumors about that stretch of land since last spring. Mineral deposits. Copper, maybe silver. Nobody's confirmed it publicly, but Richard knows, she said. Richard's known for months. That's why he's been looking for me. Not for the children, for the mineral rights which I inherited and which transfer to him if he gains legal guardianship. She stopped. He's going to take my children to steal a mine. She watched the understanding move through Elias's face, not shock, because he was not a man given to shock, but the particular settling of a man who has just identified the exact shape of a threat. "Come inside," he said. She sat at his kitchen table for the first time, and he poured coffee. He didn't have to ask if she wanted, and they talked until the sky outside went from black to gray, to the cold pale blue of a Montana winter morning. He told her what he knew about mining claim law in Wyoming territory. She told him what she remembered about the deed. He told her about a lawyer in Helena named Pryor, who was honest, which was not a common thing to say about Helena lawyers. She told him she had $34 to her name. He told her that wasn't her problem to solve alone. She told him it absolutely was. He looked at her across the table with that flat, steady look of his and said, "You've been doing everything alone for 14 months, Mrs. Doyle. How's that been working out?" She opened her mouth. She closed it. That is not a fair thing to say to a woman who dragged a broken cart 11 miles in a blizzard. "No," he said. "It's not." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I'm not saying you can't do it alone. I'm saying you don't have to. Those are different things." She looked at him for a long moment. In the gray morning light, she could see him clearly, the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried something permanent and heavy. The way he held himself like a man who'd been knocked down and had gotten back up and was not particularly interested in going through the process again. He'd lost a wife. He'd lost a child. He had rebuilt nothing, only survived, and there was a difference between those two things that she understood in her bones. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "And I want a real answer this time, not the thing about the fence line." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Alice would have been 6 in March," he said finally. "Thomas is 7. When I put that boy in the saddle and he leaned against my chest because he was too cold to hold himself up." He stopped, set his jaw, looked out the window. "That's as real an answer as I've got." She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She just sat with it, and he sat with it, and the morning came up slow and cold over the mountains. She went back to the bunkhouse to make breakfast for her children, and she told herself she would think about the rest of it later. But later came faster than she expected, because 3 days after the letter, Richard Doyle rode into the valley himself. She was in the yard when he came through the gate well-dressed, as Richard always was, on a horse that cost more than most men in the valley, made in a year, with 2 other men behind him, who had the look of hired muscle wearing lawyers' clothes. He hadn't changed much in the year since the funeral. Still thick through the middle, still carrying that expression of permanent mild satisfaction, like a man who'd spent his whole life eating at a table set for him by someone else. He looked at her and smiled. "Rebecca," he said. "God, look at you. You look terrible." "Hello, Richard. When I heard you were living out here, I didn't believe it." He looked around the yard with an expression that managed to be simultaneously bored and contemptuous. "You really brought those children out here to this?" "The children are well," she said. "They're healthy and warm and fed, and they're not your concern. See, that's where you and I disagree." He swung down from his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd never had to hurry anything. "William would have wanted me to look after them. That's all this is. Family. William never once in 12 years of marriage asked you for anything, Richard, because he didn't trust you any further than he could throw you. So don't put his name on this." Richard's smile didn't waver, but something behind it went cold. "You've got a lawyer then. Have you talked to anyone about the guardianship filing?" I've talked to people. Good. Good, I'm glad. Then you know how this looks. A woman in your condition living in a man's bunkhouse with 6 children, no employment, no home of her own. I'm not doing anything but asking a court to look at the situation. He tilted his head. You could make this very simple. There's a document I had drawn up. You sign over the mineral rights to the Wyoming land, which you've never even seen, Rebecca, which you don't know what to do with, and I withdraw the filing. The children stay with you. Everybody goes home happy. And if I don't sign... He spread his hands in a gesture of fake regret. Then we let the court decide. And the court is going to look at you and look at those children and ask some hard questions. They're going to ask why a woman your size can barely walk to town. They're going to ask what kind of example you're setting for those girls. Get off this property. The voice came from behind her, low and flat, and carrying something in it that made the 2 hired men take an involuntary step back. Elias had come out of the barn without anyone noticing him, the way a man moves when he's spent 30 years learning to read the land around him, and he was standing 15 feet from Richard Doyle with a look on his face that Rebecca had not seen before. Not anger exactly, but something older and colder than anger, something that had passed through anger and come out the other side into something far more dangerous. Richard looked at him, reassessing. Mr. Mercer, I've heard about you. I reckon you have. Get off my property. I'm just paying a family visit. You're on my land, threatening a woman who lives under my protection. Elias took one step forward, just one, and something about that single step made Richard's horse shift and pull against its reins. You said what you came to say. Now you're going to leave. Richard looked between the 2 of them. His smile had gone, but he was working hard to look like it was a choice, like he was leaving because he wanted to, not because the way Elias Mercer was standing with his hands loose at his sides had communicated something that did not require words. This isn't over, Richard said to Rebecca. I know, she said. He mounted up and rode out with his 2 men behind him, and Rebecca stood watching the gate until the sound of the horses was gone, and then she turned around to find Elias still standing where he'd been watching her. Under your protection, she said. Yes. I didn't ask for that. No, he agreed. You didn't. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said, which were the hardest 2 words she'd had to say since the bankmen came, because she'd spent 14 months refusing to need anyone, and it turned out that refusing and not needing were not the same thing at all. He nodded. He went back to the barn. She went inside and sat on her bed and folded her hands in her lap and breathed for a while. The town got worse before it got better. Someone she never found out who, but she had suspicions that lined up neatly with Richard's visit, started a rumor that made its way through Helena in the way that rumors do in small places, which is to say, everywhere at once and louder every time. The story as it reached her through Clara, who heard it from the oldest Henderson girl, who heard it from her mother, was that Rebecca Doyle was living with Elias Mercer as his woman, and that the children were left unsupervised while the 2 of them spent their days locked in the main house, and that Elias Mercer had been seen drunk in town twice since the widow moved in, which was a lie of such specific and creative cruelty that Rebecca almost admired the craftsmanship of it, since Elias didn't drink at all, hadn't touched a drop since the night of the fire that killed his family, a fact anyone in the valley who knew him could have confirmed. She heard the version with the most embellishment from Mrs. Alderman directly, who stopped her on the main street and said with the practiced sympathy of a woman who has turned cruelty into an art form, I do worry about those children, Mrs. Doyle. Children need stability. They need a mother who can be present. Rebecca looked at the woman. She felt the old heat come up in her chest, the shame that had lived in her body since she was 12 years old and outgrew everything, the shame that had been her shadow for 30 years. She felt it rise, and then she felt something else rise above it, something quieter and harder, something that had been built slowly over the last 14 months, one step at a time through a blizzard. My children are present, she said. My children are warm and fed and healthy, and they are learning to work and laugh and trust again, which is more than I can say for some children raised in fine houses by mothers who've never missed a meal in their lives. She paused. Have a good afternoon, Mrs. Alderman." She walked away. She did not look back, but her hands were shaking, and she jammed them in her coat pockets so no one would see. That evening, Elias found Daniel teaching the twins to play cards on the bunkhouse steps, and Ruth teaching Joseph a rhyme she'd learned somewhere, and Clara inside with the baby, and Thomas was in the barn. When Elias walked in to check on the animals, Thomas was standing on a stool beside the largest horse, a buckskin quarter horse named Jonas, with one small hand flat on the horse's neck and talking to him in a low, steady voice, the way Elias himself talked to horses, which was something Thomas had clearly been watching and had decided to replicate on his own initiative. Elias stood in the doorway for a moment watching the boy. Thomas heard him and turned around, and for a split second, the look on the boy's face was pure guilt, the guilt of a child caught doing something he wasn't sure was allowed. "Sorry," Thomas said quickly. "I wasn't going to hurt him. I know," Elias said. He crossed to the other side of Jonas and stood looking at the boy across the horse's back. "You've got a good hand with him. He's particular about who he lets close." Thomas looked at the horse surprised and pleased. "He threw a ranch hand last summer for patting him wrong." He reached up and ran his own hand along Jonas's neck in a long, slow stroke. "You've got to mean it. He knows if you don't." Thomas tried it slow, steady, the same motion. Jonas dropped his head slightly. "He likes it," Thomas said softly, almost to himself. "He does." Elias leaned against the post, looked at the boy. "Your daddy ever teach you about horses?" Thomas shook his head. "Papa worked underground. He said he always wanted a horse, but Mama said they couldn't afford the feed." "Your mama's practical." "She's the most practical person I know," Thomas said with a seriousness that belonged on a much older face. "She worries a lot, though. She thinks we can't tell, but we can." Elias was quiet for a moment. "She's got a lot to carry." "I know. That's why I don't ask her for things." Thomas looked at his hand on the horse's neck. "Is she going to be okay with the man who came, the one in the nice coat?" "She's going to be fine." "You don't know that." Elias looked at the boy. 7 years old, with his dead father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and a mind that had been sharpened by a year of hard things into something far older than it should have had to be. "No," Elias said honestly. "I don't know it for certain, but I can tell you that your mother is the most determined person I've met in a long time, and I've met a lot of determined people, and I can tell you that she's not going to fight this alone." Thomas considered that for a long moment. "Are you going to help her?" "I'm going to try." Thomas nodded, slow and serious, like a man accepting a contract. "Okay," he said. "Then I'll help too." He went back to stroking the horse's neck. Elias stood there in the quiet of the barn and felt something move in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Something he'd believed was gone so completely it had left no scar. Only a vacancy. It was not happiness exactly. It was something more specific than that. It was the feeling of mattering, of being inside a story where his presence made a difference to whether someone lived or died or broke or held together. He had not realized until that moment how much he had missed being necessary. He walked back to the main house and sat down at his desk and wrote a letter to the lawyer, Pryor, in Helena. He laid out the situation in plain terms, the guardianship filing the mineral rights, the man named Richard Doyle, and what he needed done. He sealed it and set it on the corner of the desk to send in the morning. Then he sat in the dark for a while with his coffee going cold, and thought about Catherine the way he did every night. Not the fire, not the end of it, but earlier the specific weight of ordinary days. The way she'd stood in this same kitchen on winter mornings with her hands wrapped around a cup. The way Alice had smelled like hay and soap when she fell asleep against his shoulder. He thought about a 7-year-old boy standing on a stool in the barn talking to a horse, trying to carry more than he should have to carry. He thought about Rebecca Doyle on the main street of Helena, with her hands in her pockets and her chin up, while a town full of people looked at her and saw something less than what she was. He blew out the lamp and went to bed. 3 days later, the lawyer sent back a response that changed the shape of everything. The mineral survey that Richard's people had commissioned wasn't just rumors. The land beneath the Wyoming deed that carried Rebecca's name had been independently assessed at a copper deposit that would, at current market rates, produce somewhere in the range of $200,000 over a 10-year extraction period. Richard had known since August. He had let Rebecca drag her children across Montana in winter, had let the bank take the trailer, had watched her nearly lose Thomas in a snowstorm on a highway, and he had said nothing because he had needed her desperate enough to sign whatever he put in front of her. Rebecca read the lawyer's letter sitting on the edge of her bed. She read it once very slowly, and then she set it down on her knee, and she sat with the number on the page. $200,000, and the full weight of what Richard had done settled over her, like the cold had settled over Thomas in the snow. The deliberateness of it, the patience of it, the way he had calculated exactly how much suffering it would take to break her and had been willing to let her children suffer to reach that number. She picked the letter back up. She thought of Thomas saying, "She thinks we can't tell, but we can." She thought of Clara carrying the baby 4 miles through a blizzard. She thought of Joseph's boots coming apart at the seam. Something in her went very, very quiet. "Clara," she called. Clara appeared in the bunkhouse doorway, alert the way she'd been alert since the funeral, always listening for the tone that meant something real was happening. "Mama, go get Mr. Mercer," Rebecca said. "Tell him I need to talk to him, now." Clara looked at her face for a moment, reading it the way her children had learned to read her, the particular stillness, the particular set of the jaw that meant she was not afraid, but she was ready. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said and ran. Elias read the lawyer's letter standing at the kitchen table, and Rebecca watched his face the way she'd learned to watch it, not for big expressions, because Elias Mercer didn't do big expressions, but for the small shifts, the jaw tightening, the slight pull around his eyes. He set it down. $200,000, he said, give or take. And he let you walk that road in a blizzard. He needed me desperate, Rebecca said. A woman with options doesn't sign away a copper mine for nothing. A woman freezing to death with 6 children might. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do?" "I want to fight him." She said it without hesitation, without the pause she'd have needed a month ago to work up to the words. "I want to hire Pryor and file a counter-response to the guardianship claim and make Richard prove in a courtroom in front of a judge that I am an unfit mother. And then I want to watch him try." "That costs money." "I know. I've got some set aside." She looked at him sharply. "No." "Rebecca, no, I won't take money from you, Elias. I won't do it." She crossed her arms, and she knew how it looked stubborn, proud, impractical, and she didn't care. There has to be another way. He thought about it for a moment. The mining company, the one that did the survey. If they know the deposit exists, they'll want access rights. You could negotiate in advance against future extraction. She stared at him. "I didn't think of that. It's your land. They need your permission to dig. That's leverage." He looked at her steadily. "You've got more cards than Richard wants you to know you have." Something shifted in her chest. Not relief exactly, but the specific feeling of solid ground appearing under a foot that was already falling. She sat down at his kitchen table, and they worked through it together for 2 hours. The legal timeline, the mining company's contact information that Pryor had included in his letter, the specific documents Richard would need to produce to support the guardianship claim, and the specific gaps in his case that Pryor had already identified. When they were done, she had 4 pages of notes in her own handwriting and a plan that was fragile and imperfect and real. "He's not going to stop," Elias said when they finished. "Richard Doyle's put too much into this. When the legal route starts going sideways, he'll look for another one." "I know. I want you to move the children into the main house." She looked up. "Elias?" "Not for any reason, except that the bunkhouse has 1 door and no second exit, and if somebody comes in the night, I want you to have options." He met her eyes. "I'll take the bunkhouse." She looked at him for a long moment. "The town's already talking." Let them talk. He said it the same way she'd said it to Mrs. Alderman, flat and final, a door closing on something that didn't deserve to stay open. She moved the children that same evening quietly without ceremony. Elias carried Thomas on his back because Thomas asked him to, with the easy confidence of a child who has decided an adult is trustworthy and sees no reason to be shy about it. Clara brought the baby. Daniel carried the two heaviest bags without being asked. The twins held each other's hands and Joseph fell asleep before they got to the main house door. That night, for the first time in over a year, Rebecca slept in a room with a lock on the door. She lay in the dark and listened to her children breathing around her in the two adjoining rooms, and she thought about Richard Doyle sitting somewhere comfortable and warm, planning his next move, and she felt something crystallize inside her that she didn't have a name for yet. Something hard and clear and very, very cold. She fell asleep before she could find the name for it. The response from the mining company came back in 4 days. Faster than she'd expected, which told her something about how much they wanted access to that copper. The advance they were offering against extraction rights was $12,000, enough for lawyers, enough for a year of stability, enough to change the entire shape of the fight. She was reading the letter on the porch when Clara came outside and stood beside her. "Is it good?" Clara asked. "It's very good." Clara exhaled slowly. "Richard's not going to like it." "No, he is not." "Mama." Clara was quiet for a moment. 11 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a year of hard education behind her. What's he going to do when he finds out? Rebecca folded the letter. "Something we'll handle when it comes." It came on a Thursday 3 weeks later at 2 in the morning. Rebecca woke to the sound of Jonas screaming, not the nervous stamp and whinny of a startled horse, the full animal shriek of a horse that smells fire and knows what fire means, and the sound of it came through the walls of the main house like a blade, and Rebecca was on her feet before she was fully awake. She heard Clara's voice from the next room, sharp and frightened. "Mama! Stay with the children. Don't open the door." She went to the window. The barn was burning. Not starting to burn. Already burning, the whole near wall of it lit orange and red, the flames moving fast and purposeful, the way fire moves when it's been helped along. And moving between the barn and the fence line, she could see shapes, 3 men, maybe 4, dark coats, faces covered. Her stomach went cold and clear. This wasn't accident. This wasn't lightning. She heard Elias's voice from the direction of the bunkhouse, a short, sharp shout, then silence. Her heart slammed once hard, and she crossed to the fireplace and took his rifle down from the hooks above the mantel. She'd fired a rifle twice in her life. Both times she'd hit what she aimed at. She went to the front door. "Mrs. Doyle." One of the men had come to stand in front of the porch. He was built heavy, wearing a scarf across the lower half of his face, and his voice had the particular flat tone of a hired man doing a job. "Richard Doyle sends his regards. There's a document on the gate post. You sign it tonight, the fire stays in the barn. You don't—" He paused. "Well, it's a cold night to be homeless again." Rebecca opened the front door and stepped onto the porch with the rifle in her hands. She heard one of the other men laugh, a low, mean sound from somewhere to her left. "That's the woman, Lord. I heard she was big, but—" "Shut up," the man in front said quickly. But she'd heard it. She heard every word of it, and she felt it land the way those words always landed, in the old deep place where the 12-year-old girl who'd outgrown everything still lived. She felt the hot rush of shame that she'd carried for 30 years like a second skin. And then she heard Thomas's voice from inside, just his voice, sleepy and small, saying, "Mama!" through the closed door, and something happened inside her that she could not have predicted and could not have prepared for. The shame burned off. Like fog burning off in direct sunlight, it went, and what was underneath it wasn't what she'd expected. Underneath it wasn't anger. Underneath it was something simpler and stronger and older than anger. She raised the rifle, and she planted her feet on that porch, and she looked at the man in front of her. "Get off this property," she said. "Right now." He actually laughed. "Ma'am, look at—" The crack of the rifle split the night air like a thunderclap. The shot went into the fence post 6 inches from his left ear, close enough that he felt the air move. He stopped laughing. "The next one doesn't miss," Rebecca said. "My children are in this house. You picked the wrong night and the wrong woman." Dead silence. The fire crackled in the barn. Jonas was still screaming somewhere inside it, and the sound of it was tearing at her, because that horse had carried Thomas on his back, and she could not think about that right now. She heard one of the men at the back start to move, shifting position, circling, and she moved the rifle barrel toward the sound, without looking away from the man in front of her. "I hear every one of you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was shaking from the knees down, but her voice was steady, and she would take steady. "There are 6 of my children in this house. I will shoot any man who takes one more step, and I will not miss again." A pause. 3 seconds. 5. Then she heard hoofbeats, hard and fast, coming from the Helena Road, and the man in front of her turned his head toward the sound, and Rebecca tracked the rifle back to him without flinching. Elias came through the gate at a dead gallop on his second horse, the roan he kept for distance riding, and he was off the animal before it fully stopped moving through the yard, with a purpose that scattered 2 of Richard's men backward before they'd consciously decided to move. She'd seen Elias Mercer controlled, deliberate, economical. She had never seen him like this. "Elias," she started. He looked at her on the porch rifle, up, feet planted, facing down 4 hired men alone in the dark. And something crossed his face that she felt more than saw. Then he turned to the man who'd been talking to her, and he covered the distance between them in 4 steps, and he took the man by the front of his coat and lifted him off the ground. "Jonas is in that barn," Elias said. His voice was barely above a whisper. That was more frightening than shouting would have been. "You set fire to a barn with a horse inside it." "He's not. It's fine, the horse got out. Someone opened the—" "Who hired you?" A beat of silence that was its own answer. "Richard Doyle," Rebecca said from the porch. "We know it was Richard. Put him down, Elias." Elias didn't move. His hands were shaking. Rebecca had not seen his hands shake before. "Elias." She said his name the way she would have said Thomas's name when Thomas needed to come back to himself. Steady, direct, present. "Put him down. He's not worth it. Put him down and look at me." A long moment. The fire roared in the barn. The man's boots dangled 6 inches off the ground. Then Elias set him down and stepped back, and he turned and looked at her. And for the first time she saw on his face everything that had been behind the flatness all along. The grief, the rage, the 2 years of accumulated loss. The specific agony of watching something he'd just started to care about be threatened by someone who'd calculated exactly how much it would hurt. "Rebecca," he said, and her name in his voice sounded different from how anyone had said it in a very long time. She lowered the rifle. "I'm all right," she said. "We're all right." The man in the scarf scrambled to his feet and backed toward the gate. His companions were already had gone, the moment Elias came through the gate, melting into the dark, with the professional instinct of men who understood that a job had gone sideways. And the smart move was to not be present when someone started asking questions. "You tell Richard," Rebecca called after him, "that I found a lawyer and a mining company and $12,000 that he doesn't know I have. You tell him the legal fight starts Monday. And you tell him—" She paused, found the words. "You tell him he can come here himself next time, if he wants to look me in the eye, because I'll be standing right here." The man said nothing. He went through the gate. The sound of a horse retreating into the dark came back to them for a moment, then faded. The barn wall groaned, and a section of the roof collapsed inward in a cascade of sparks, and Rebecca flinched toward the sound. "Jonas got out," Elias said. "I opened the stall before I rode to town. He's in the upper pasture." He looked at the burning barn. "Losing the barn, that's months of work." "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry." He looked at her on the porch, the rifle in her hands, her feet still planted, her chin still up. "Are you hurt?" "No." "You're shaking." "I know. My legs seem to have opinions about this that the rest of me disagrees with." She sat down on the porch step and put the rifle across her knees and pressed both hands flat on her thighs. "They said something." Before you came. One of them said something about my... She stopped. It doesn't matter what they said. Elias sat down beside her on the step. It never stops landing, she said quietly, almost to herself. I keep thinking it's going to stop landing and it never does. They can say it 100 times, and the 101st time still... She pressed her lips together. I stood there with a rifle in my hands and it still landed. You still stood there, Elias said. She looked at him. They said it and you raised the rifle anyway. He looked out at the burning barn. That's not nothing, Rebecca. That's everything. She looked at him for a long moment. She wanted to say something and didn't have the words for it yet, which was unusual for her, and she was still sitting with the silence of it when she heard the sound. Hoofbeats again. But not one horse this time. Several. Coming from the valley road and from the north track, and from the direction of the Henderson spread to the east, coming from multiple directions at once, which meant the first lantern appeared at the gate, then another, then she lost count. They came in ones and twos, ranchers and farmers, and the man who ran the livery, and the woman from the church auxiliary, and the young Henderson boys, who were barely old enough to shave, every one of them, carrying either a lantern or a rifle, or both coming out of the dark in the middle of the night. Because somewhere in the valley, a fire had lit up the sky and a barn had started burning. And in this particular valley on this particular night, that had meant something that was not nothing. The livery man. A wide man named Cole, with a gray beard and a voice like a mill wheel, came through the gate first. He looked at the barn. He looked at Rebecca on the porch step. He took his hat off. Mrs. Doyle, he said, we came as soon as we saw the sky. She didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. We know who did this, Cole said. He looked at Elias. Same man who's been filing papers on those children. Same man who's been buying up information in Helena. He reset his hat. We figured you could use some company. Rebecca stood up. She looked out at the gathering of people, neighbors Elias had helped in silence for years. People she'd never met. People who'd heard the rumors Mrs. Alderman spread and apparently had decided to make up their own minds about what they believed. There's a man in Cheyenne, she said, who thinks I'm too broken and too alone to fight back. Reckon he miscalculated, Cole said. Reckon he did. She looked at Elias. Something passed between them. Not words, not yet, but the weight of something that was building toward words. Then she looked back at the gathered neighbors. We need to put that fire out before it jumps the fence line, if enough of you are willing. Every man there moved at once. They worked through the rest of the night, hauling water, beating embers, pulling fence sections away from the burn, and Rebecca worked alongside them, not organizing from the porch, but in the middle of it, her hands blistered, and her coat smelling like smoke, and nobody said a word about her size, or her pace, or what she looked like. They just worked because the work needed doing and she was doing it. At some point near dawn, when the fire was down to smoldering timber and the immediate danger had passed, Thomas appeared at the main house door in his nightshirt and wool socks, having woken up and found the house empty. He looked at the ruined barn. He looked at his mother standing in the yard, soot-streaked and exhausted, surrounded by a crowd of people she barely knew. "Mama," he called, "are you okay?" She turned around. And despite everything, the shaking, the smoke in her lungs, the burned hands, the 200,000 reasons a man in Cheyenne was trying to destroy her life, she smiled. "Come here, baby," she said. "Come see what our neighbors did." He ran across the yard in his wool socks, and she caught him and held him against her side, and he looked at the gathered faces and the dying fire and the gray beginning light over the mountains. "Why did they come?" he asked. Rebecca looked at Cole, who was refilling his water bucket with the steady patience of a man who's learned that most things worth doing take longer than you want. She looked at the Henderson boys, dragging a scorched beam away from the fence. She looked at Elias 20 yards away, talking quietly with two of the ranchers, still moving, still working, the same man who had once lived on this ranch alone for 2 years, because he'd stopped believing he was worth showing up for. Because it turns out, Rebecca said, that we weren't as alone as Richard needed us to be. Thomas considered that. Good. he said simply. The last of the fire went dark just as the sun came up, and in Helena, in a hotel room with a window facing west, Richard Doyle received a message from his hired man. 3 words scrawled on a single page, and read it twice, and the particular expression on his face was not rage, not yet, but the colder and more deliberate expression of a man who has just understood that the easy route is closed and is already mapping the hard one. The message read, "She didn't sign." The morning after the fire, Rebecca wrote 2 letters. The first went to Pryor, the lawyer in Helena. It was 3 pages long and contained every detail she could reconstruct about Richard Doyle's timeline, when he'd learned about the mineral survey, when he'd first contacted Caldwell and Pierce, when the bankmen had come for the trailer, the specific wording of the child welfare report that had been filed against her in Billings. She'd been carrying those dates in her head for months. She put them on paper now, with the precision of a woman who understood that precision was its own kind of weapon. The second letter went to the mining company in Cheyenne. She sealed both letters and handed them to Cole, the liveryman, who was still there at 7 in the morning because he'd slept 3 hours on Elias's kitchen floor rather than ride home in the dark, and who accepted the letters with the no-nonsense manner of a man who had decided where he stood and did not require further discussion about it. "Helena today?" she asked. "First thing," Cole said. He tucked the letters into his coat, looked at her hands, which were bandaged from the night before. "You need anything else?" "I need a courthouse that isn't in Richard Doyle's pocket," she said. Cole thought about that. "Judge Beaumont's out of Missoula. He doesn't take money from men in nice coats." He paused. "I might know somebody who could make sure this lands on his docket." She looked at him. "Why are you doing all this?" He pulled his hat on and looked at her with the mild expression of a man who considers the question slightly absurd. "Because Elias Mercer has been pulling this valley through hard winters for 15 years and never once asked for anything back. And because any woman who stands on a burning porch with a rifle and tells 4 hired men to go to hell has earned some help." He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." He walked out. The trial was set for 4 weeks out in Missoula before Judge Beaumont. Richard spent those 4 weeks being very busy and not quietly. He had 2 more witnesses added to the child welfare record, a county official in Billings, who Rebecca had never met, and a doctor whose name appeared nowhere in any medical record connected to her family. He filed a supplemental affidavit, claiming Rebecca had been observed in a state of moral compromise at the Mercer Ranch, the language of which made her hands shake when Pryor read it to her in his office. He approached 3 of the valley neighbors who'd come to help the night of the fire, and offered each of them an amount of money that she'd never see in a year. None of them took it. She found out about the offers from Cole, who had found out from the Henderson boys, who had found out from the man Richard had sent to do the offering, a detail that suggested Richard's operation was less airtight than he believed. "He's scared," Elias said one evening when she told him. "Scared men are dangerous. Scared men also make mistakes." He was mending harness at the table. He did most of his talking. While his hands were busy, she'd noticed it was easier for him that way, the words coming out sideways instead of head-on. He added witnesses nobody can find records of. He added a doctor who doesn't appear in any directory Pryor's checked. "That's not confidence, Rebecca. That's desperation." She looked at him across the table. "What if it doesn't matter? What if Beaumont looks at me and sees what everyone else sees?" Elias set the harness down. "What does everyone else see?" She didn't answer, because the answer was too familiar and too old, and she was tired of giving it airtime. "Tell me," he said. Not pressing, just asking. "A fat widow who can't manage her own life," she said flatly. "A woman who needs a man to fix her problems and still couldn't manage to keep her children out of a blizzard. A woman who—" She stopped. "You know what that man said on the porch? The night of the fire." "I heard." "People believe it, Elias. It's not about Richard. People believe I'm less. They believe my body is evidence of something wrong with my character, and no amount of standing on porches with rifles changes what they see when they look at me." He was quiet for a long moment. "You know what I saw," he said. "The night I found you on that road. A problem to solve." No. He looked at her directly, the way he looked at things he was serious about, straight on, no deflection. I saw a woman who had been walking 4 hours in a blizzard and was still walking. I saw a woman holding a child who'd stopped shivering and not stopping. I saw somebody who'd been hit with every hard thing a person can be hit with and was still moving. He paused. I don't know what you look like to other people. I know what I saw. She held his eyes for a moment. Something in her chest moved careful slow, like ice beginning to shift in early spring. We should go over the testimony documents, she said. We should. He agreed and picked the harness back up. That was how they managed it. The approaching thing between them, whatever shape it was taking, they went around it, both of them careful and deliberate, because neither of them was ready yet, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so out loud. They talked about the trial and the legal documents and the children's schooling and the plans for rebuilding the barn, and underneath all of it, the approaching thing kept building quiet and patient, the way weather builds before anyone can see the sky change. The night before they left for Missoula, Thomas couldn't sleep. Rebecca found him at 2 a.m, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water, fully dressed, his boots on. You planning on going somewhere? She asked. I couldn't sleep. I noticed. She sat across from him. What's wrong? He looked at the table. What if the judge says Richard gets us? He won't. But what if he does? She looked at her son, 7 years old, his father's jaw eyes that had seen too much and processed most of it quietly, and saved the rest for 2 a.m. at kitchen tables. Then we fight the decision. And then we fight the next one after that. Do you understand me? There is no version of this where I stop fighting. There is no judge and no court and no man in a nice coat who can convince me to stop. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Mama, do you like Mr. Mercer? She blinked. The shift was so abrupt it took her a moment to follow it. That's a different subject, Thomas. Clara says you do. Clara is 11 and she talks too much. Daniel says he's the best man he's ever known except for Papa. Rebecca was quiet. I think so too, Thomas said simply. I just wanted you to know that. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Go to bed, baby. He went. She sat at the table alone for a while longer. The courtroom in Missoula was full on the first day of the hearing. Rebecca had not expected that. She'd expected a small proceeding, a judge lawyers herself on one side and Richard on the other. Instead, the gallery was packed. Cole was there, and the Henderson family, and the woman from the church auxiliary, and a dozen faces she recognized from the night of the fire, and a dozen more she didn't recognize at all, but who had apparently come anyway, because word had traveled the way word travels in a valley where people pay attention to what happens to their neighbors. Richard was seated at his table with 2 lawyers in pressed suits, and he looked at the gallery with an expression that moved from surprise to contempt in about 3 seconds. He caught Rebecca's eye across the room and gave her the smile she'd hated for 12 years, the one that said he already knew how this ended. She looked away from him and focused on Pryor, who was going over his notes with the specific focused energy of a man who has done his homework. He's going to lead with the welfare report, Pryor said quietly. Let him. The doctor's testimony is where we take him apart. You found something. I found that Dr. Emery Whitfield, who signed the supplemental affidavit, claiming to have evaluated the Doyle children and found them malnourished and at risk, has not practiced medicine in Montana Territory since 1881. His license lapsed. He currently works as an accountant in Denver. Pryor looked up at her with the satisfied expression of a man holding a card he's been waiting to play. Richard Doyle submitted testimony from a man who cannot legally give medical testimony in this jurisdiction, and he did it without apparently checking whether anyone would notice. Rebecca stared at him. He assumed nobody would look. He assumed you'd be too overwhelmed to fight back. He built his whole case on that assumption. Pryor closed his folder. People do that. They see a woman in a hard situation and they assume the hardness has taken something out of her. They forget that sometimes it puts something in instead. She thought about that for a moment. Then she straightened in her chair and faced the front of the courtroom. Richard's case took 4 hours. His lead lawyer was smooth and practiced, and he built the picture of Rebecca Doyle carefully. The blizzard, the trailer, the mining camp debt, the months of apparent homelessness, the living arrangement with an unmarried man. He called 2 witnesses who testified to the chaos of the bunkhouse and the children's state when they'd first arrived on the Mercer Ranch. He was persuasive and thorough, and Rebecca sat through it with her hands folded in her lap and her expression giving away nothing. Then Pryor stood up. He was methodical. He was precise. He started with the mining survey dates. Documentation, the paper trail showing Richard had commissioned and received the survey results in August, while Rebecca was still in the trailer before William had been 3 months in the ground. He showed the court the letter Richard had sent to Caldwell and Pierce the week after the trailer was repossessed. He showed the timeline every step of Rebecca's collapse, mapped against Richard's knowledge of the mineral rights beneath the Wyoming land. He made the court see it the way Rebecca had seen it at 2 in the morning, the deliberate calculation of a man who had needed her broken. Then he got to Dr. Whitfield. Richard's lawyer objected 3 times in 40 seconds. Judge Beaumont overruled all 3 and looked at Richard across the courtroom with an expression that had stopped being neutral. It took the jury 40 minutes. When the foreman stood up and read the decision, Rebecca heard Clara make a sound behind her, a small caught sound like someone who's been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally been told they can stop. She heard Thomas say something to Daniel in a whisper that she couldn't make out. She felt Elias's hand come to rest on the back of her chair, not touching her, just present just there. Richard Doyle stood across the room with his jaw set and his eyes moving rapidly between his lawyers, looking for the angle, the appeal, the next move, and for a moment she saw it clearly. He would keep looking. He would find another lawyer and another argument and another day in another courtroom, because men like Richard didn't stop when they lost. They recalculated. But they also never expected women like her to be there for the recalculation. She held his eyes across the room until he looked away first. Outside the courthouse in the cold Missoula air, Cole was grinning so hard his beard moved. The Henderson boys were whooping. The woman from the church auxiliary was crying in a contained, dignified way that suggested she was very pleased with herself for crying in a contained, dignified way. Clara was holding the baby so tight that the baby was squirming, and Daniel was standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the way his father's jaw used to set. Not the grief version this time, but the other version, the proud version. Thomas pushed through to Rebecca and wrapped both arms around her waist without a word. She held him there. She looked over his head and found Elias standing a few feet away, hat in hand, watching the family scene with the expression of a man who is very consciously placing himself at the edge of something he is not yet sure he is allowed to be inside of. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out her free hand and held it there and waited. He took 3 steps and took her hand, and that was the beginning of everything. It was 2 weeks after the trial when he asked her. He did it badly. She told him so afterward, affectionately, more than once. He did it in the kitchen at 6 in the morning with neither of them fully awake, which was not the setting a woman imagines for the most important question of her life. He set down his coffee cup and said without preamble or poetry, "I want to marry you, and I want to adopt those children, if you'll let me." She looked at him. She felt the old voice rise up, the one that had been telling her for 30 years what she was and wasn't worth, what she did and didn't deserve, what a reasonable person should and shouldn't expect from life. She felt it start to speak. "Elias," she said, "you could have a life that isn't this complicated. You could find a—" "Stop," he said. "I'm serious. You're 30 years old and you're taking on a widow and 6 children and a legal battle and a man in Cheyenne who's going to keep coming. Rebecca." He said her name the way he'd said it on the porch the night of the fire, straight and simple, and carrying something underneath it that she'd been trying not to look at directly, because looking at it directly scared her. "You think I saved you. You've been thinking that since the night I found you on that road. You've been keeping score, trying to figure out what you owe, trying to find the point where you've taken too much." She didn't answer because that was precisely what she'd been doing. "I was going to sell this ranch," he said. "Before you came, I'd made up my mind. There was no reason to keep it. Catherine was gone. Alice was gone. and I was just using up days." He looked at the table. "You dragged that broken cart through my gate, and your son leaned against my chest in the saddle, and I went inside that night, and for the first time in 2 years, I didn't fall asleep thinking about how much quieter everything was going to get." She was very still. "You think I saved you," he said. "But you're the reason I stayed alive." The thing she'd been careful not to feel for 3 months arrived all at once, the way weather arrives after a long build-up, and she sat with it for a moment, the fullness of it, the unexpected size of it, and then she said, "Yes." He looked up. "Yes," she said again. "I'll marry you." He exhaled a long, slow release, like a man who'd been holding weight he'd forgotten he was holding. "Good," he said. And he picked his coffee back up because Elias Mercer expressed profound emotion the way other people changed a shoe practically without ceremony, and then moved on to the next thing. She married him on a Saturday in March in the church in Helena, with her 6 children in the front pew, and Cole standing up as witness, and the woman from the church auxiliary crying again in her contained, dignified way. The ceremony was short, because both of them had said enough by then. The only moment anyone remarked on afterward was when Elias turned to look at Rebecca walking up the aisle, and the expression on his face was not the face of a composed former rodeo champion, but the face of a man who had stopped composing himself and decided to feel things directly. She wore the deep brown wool he had left at her door 3 months earlier. She had made it herself. The adoption papers went through in April. On the morning the certificate arrived, Thomas read his new name aloud 3 times. Thomas William Mercer, with the specific gravity of a 7-year-old who understands that some things are permanent. Then he went to find Elias in the yard and stood in front of him and said, "Can I call you Dad now?" Elias looked at the boy for a moment. He crouched down to eye level, which was something he did with the children, never loomed over them, always came down to where they were. "You've been calling me that in your head for 2 months, he said. "I reckon it's time." Thomas nodded satisfied and ran off. Daniel waited until that evening when he and Elias were working the rebuilt fence line in the last light and said it quietly, almost under his breath, as if testing the weight of the word Dad. Elias kept working, but his hands stilled for exactly 1 second, and that second was everything. The community kitchen opened in May in a rented space on the main street in Helena that Mrs. Alderman walked past every morning and had to watch fill up with women who needed a hot meal and a place to sit down that didn't require them to explain themselves or apologize for their lives. Rebecca ran it 3 days a week. Clara helped on Saturdays. The Helena newspaper sent a reporter in June, and the story ran on the front page with a photograph of Rebecca standing in the kitchen doorway, broad-shouldered, upright entirely herself, and the caption read, "Mrs. Rebecca Mercer, who opened the Valley's first community kitchen for families in need." Not one word about her size. She cut the article out and put it in the tin box where she kept important papers. She went back to the ranch that evening and stood on the porch in the late summer light and watched her children move across the yard. Thomas in the barn, talking to Jonas. Clara hanging laundry with May and Ruth Daniel and Joseph, racing each other to the fence line for reasons that were clear only to them. And she felt the weight of the ordinary day settle over her, like something she'd been waiting to carry for a very long time. Elias came out and stood beside her. "Good day," he said. "Yes." She looked at the yard, the children, the rebuilt barn, the mountains beyond all of it. "A very good day." He stood beside her in the late light without needing to fill the silence, the way he'd always stood beside silence, easy with it, at home in it. But it was a different silence than the one she'd first heard on that frozen road. That one had been the silence of a man who'd been emptied out. This one was the silence of a man who was full. She thought of herself 14 months ago on a highway at 2 a.m, dragging a broken cart through 3 feet of snow with 6 children behind her, believing, knowing bone deep, that she was alone in the world, and that alone was what she deserved. She had believed it so completely that she'd almost let it kill her children rather than ask for help. She thought of the moment on that porch with the rifle in her hands, when the words had landed and the shame had come up, and then something older and stronger had come up underneath it and she had planted her feet anyway. She reached out and found Elias's hand in the evening dark. He closed his fingers over hers without looking down. And in Cheyenne, Richard Doyle's third appeal was denied by a federal circuit judge who had read the trial transcript and written in his decision that the evidence of deliberate manipulation was, in his words, among the most egregious examples of bad faith legal conduct this court has encountered in 20 years of practice. The letter informing Rebecca arrived on a Thursday. She read it at the kitchen table while Thomas ate breakfast beside her and asked if he could have more biscuits, and she said yes, and she folded the letter very precisely and put it in the tin box. Then she made more biscuits because the children were hungry, and the morning was clear, and there was nothing left of Richard Doyle that was worth one more second of her attention. 5 years changed the shape of things. Not the mountains, not the valley, not the way the winter came down hard off the peaks every November like it had something to prove, but everything else. Everything inside the fence line of the Mercer Ranch had been rebuilt, rearranged, expanded by the specific and stubborn force of people who had decided to stay. The barn stood again bigger than before because Daniel had drawn the plans himself, and Daniel had his father's bone structure and his mother's practicality, and an absolute refusal to build anything that couldn't hold up under hard use. He was 17 now, and he worked the fence line without being asked, and had taken to rising before Elias in the mornings, which Elias had noted without comment, except to start making 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. Thomas was 12, and had grown so fast in the last year that Rebecca kept finding him in clothes that had fit him 3 months ago and didn't fit him anymore, and he still talked to Jonas every morning before breakfast, which the horse accepted as his due. Clara was 16 and had started helping at the community kitchen on days that weren't Saturdays, which had become its own argument, a good one, the kind of argument that meant things were working. "You need to be in school," Rebecca told her. "I'm learning more here," Clara said. "That is not the point. Mama Mrs. Holt came in this morning with 4 children and no coat, and she hadn't eaten since Tuesday. Tell me what I'm supposed to learn in school that's more important than knowing how to help her." Rebecca looked at her daughter 16. Her father's stubbornness, her mother's eyes, and something entirely her own that neither of them had put there something clear and direct and certain. She thought about herself at 16, already ashamed of her body, already apologizing for taking up space. "You come back for the afternoon lessons," Rebecca said. "That's not negotiable." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said in the tone that meant she'd already calculated that the morning was worth the trade. The community kitchen had grown from a rented space on Helena's main street into something that Rebecca hadn't entirely planned and wouldn't have known to plan a network loose and practical of women across the valley who knew each other's names and knew which doors were open and which weren't. She hadn't organized it deliberately. It had organized itself around the specific fact of her presence, the way water organizes itself around solid ground. Women came because they'd heard about her. They'd heard the version that had been in the Helena paper, and they'd heard the older version that passed between women in the particular way that women pass the stories they need quietly. With the important parts emphasized the name of the woman who'd stood on her porch with a rifle while her barn burned behind her, and said the next one doesn't miss. They came, and she fed them, and she sat with them, and she told them in plain terms what she'd learned, which lawyers in the territory were honest, which mining companies paid fair wage to widows with land claims, which judges heard cases without their palms already warm from someone else's money. She was not a soft woman. She had never been a soft woman. But she had learned the difference between hardness that breaks other people and hardness that holds them up, and she worked every day to be the second kind. It was on a Thursday in November, 5 years to the month, since Elias had ridden out of a Montana blizzard and said 4 words that changed every life in her family, that the Henderson boy came to the kitchen door and said there was a situation in town. He was 22 now, the older Henderson boy, a man though she still thought of him as the kid who'd come through the gate with a lantern the night of the fire. He had the look of someone who'd seen something he wasn't sure what to do with. "There's a girl at the stage depot," he said. "Been there since this morning. Nobody knows her. She's got 2 bags, and she won't talk to anyone, and Mrs. Alderman tried to have the sheriff move her along and—" "How old?" Rebecca said. 15, maybe. 16. Is she hurt? I don't think so. Just... He stopped. She's sitting in the snow, Mrs. Mercer. She won't come inside. Rebecca took her coat from the hook and went to the door. Then she stopped. She thought about it for a moment, the specific image of a girl sitting in the snow with 2 bags, and she said, "Go to the ranch, tell Elias to come." Henderson looked slightly confused. "You want me to ride all the way out to—" "Tell him a girl of the stage depot needs him. He'll understand." He went. She walked the 4 blocks to the stage depot alone, because 4 blocks was nothing. Now had been nothing for years, and the cold air was clean and sharp, and she walked through it without hurrying, because she had learned that some situations needed to be arrived at calmly. The girl was sitting on her 2 bags against the depot wall, arms wrapped around herself, head down. She was thin, the kind of thin that isn't a choice, and her coat was too light for November, and her boots had seen better days, and there was a cut above her left eyebrow that was several days old and hadn't been properly cleaned. Rebecca stopped a few feet away and stood for a moment just looking, cataloging. The girl felt the attention and looked up, and her eyes, brown, wary, exhausted, did what young eyes do when they've been approached by too many adults with too many opinions about their situation. They went flat and defensive. "I ain't bothering nobody," the girl said. "I didn't say you were. The sheriff already came by. I got a right to sit here." "You do," Rebecca agreed. She didn't move closer, just stood in her coat in the cold with the same patience she'd developed over 5 years of women who weren't ready to be helped and needed someone to wait without leaving. "I'm Rebecca Mercer. I run the kitchen 2 blocks east. We've got hot food and a warm room." The girl looked at her. "What do you want?" "Nothing," Rebecca said. "That's not how it works at my kitchen. You come in, you eat, you leave whenever you want. Nobody asks you for anything." A pause. The girl's jaw was set in a way that was so familiar it made Rebecca's chest ache, the particular set of someone who has learned that need is dangerous, that asking is the thing that gets you hurt. "I don't need charity," the girl said. "It's not charity, it's dinner." Rebecca tilted her head. "You eaten today?" A beat too long before the answer came. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." The girl looked away. Her hands, Rebecca noticed, were shaking, not from the cold alone. "What's your name?" Rebecca asked. A long silence. Then, like something pulled out of her against her will, "Nora. Nora." Rebecca said it simply, the way she'd learned to say things without adding weight to them. "I've got beef stew on the stove and my daughter baked bread this morning and the kitchen is warm. That's all I'm offering." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind those wary eyes, some internal calculation that Rebecca recognized because she'd watched it happen in 100 women's faces over 5 years. The math of risk versus need run fast and rough in the space between heartbeats. "Just dinner," Nora said. "Just dinner." She got the girl to the kitchen and sat her at the table nearest the stove and put food in front of her without ceremony, because ceremony made things feel like more than they were, and the girl needed things to feel simple right now. Clara appeared from the back room, read the situation in one glance, and said only, "I'll get more bread," and disappeared again. That was Clara at 16. Her read on people was better than most adults, Rebecca knew. Nora ate the way people eat when they have been genuinely hungry for more than one day. Rebecca sat across from her and did not watch and did not look away, which was a skill, and talked about nothing in particular. The kitchen, the weather, the Henderson boy who'd come to tell her about the girl in the snow. A story that was mildly funny and required nothing from Nora except to listen. By the time the bowl was empty, Nora's hands had stopped shaking. "Where are you from?" Rebecca asked. "Billings." "Long way." "Yes, ma'am." Rebecca looked at the cut above her eyebrow and did not ask about it directly because asking directly would close the door. "Is there someone looking for you in Billings?" Nora's jaw set again. "Not the way you mean." "Okay." A silence. Then very quietly, "My stepfather's looking for me, but not because he—" She stopped, started again. I'm not going back. You don't have to, Rebecca said. Just that. Not a plan, not a solution, not a list of options. Just the plain statement of the thing the girl needed to hear first. Nora looked at her. Her eyes had gone liquid in a way that she was clearly working hard to control, because she was the kind of girl who'd learned that crying in front of people cost something. I don't have anywhere to go, she said. I had enough money for the stage this far, and I thought I'd figure the rest out when I got here, and I've been sitting out there since morning trying to figure it out. And I can't. Her voice cracked once clean and sharp like ice breaking. She pressed her lips together. I can't figure it out. You don't have to figure it out tonight, Rebecca said. Tonight you eat, and you're warm, and you're safe. That's enough for tonight. The door opened. Elias came in from the cold with his hat in his hand, and that look on his face, the specific look he'd had since the night she'd first seen him in a blizzard. The one she'd learned meant he'd assessed a situation and decided what it required of him. He looked at Nora at the table. He looked at Rebecca. She gave him the smallest nod. He crossed to the stove, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the far end of the table, not crowding, not pushing, just present. The way he'd always been present. Solid and unhurried, and giving the room enough space to breathe. Cold night, he said to no one in particular. Nora looked at him, then at Rebecca, then back at him. Who's this? My husband, Rebecca said. Elias. He nodded at the girl. Nora. She blinked. How'd you? Rebecca told me. He wrapped both hands around his cup. You eaten enough? Yes, sir. Good. He looked at his coffee. We've got a room at the ranch. It's been sitting empty. If you need somewhere to be while you figure out the next thing. Nora stared at him. You don't know me. No, he agreed. I didn't know Rebecca either first night I saw her. A silence. Rebecca watched Nora's face. The calculation running again faster this time. Different variables. She watched the girl try to find the angle to catch the thing being asked in return. Nothing's free, Nora said. Her voice was flat. Not rude, just the flatness of someone who has been taught that lesson too many times to unlearn it easily. Elias looked at the girl directly. You're right, he said. Here's what we ask. You stay, you pull your weight. Help in the kitchen. Help on the ranch. Learn something useful. You don't have to talk about billings until you want to. You don't have to decide anything tonight except whether you want to sleep inside or out. He paused. That's it. Nora looked at him for a long time. Her jaw was still set, but her eyes were different now. Something behind them was moving. Something that had been very still for a very long time, beginning carefully to shift. Why? She said. Not aggressive. Genuinely asking. Why would you do that for somebody you don't know? Elias looked at Rebecca, just for a moment, just long enough for the look to mean something. Because somebody did it for us, he said. That was the moment. Rebecca felt it the specific second when Nora's defense didn't drop exactly, but developed a crack the way frozen ground develops a crack in early spring when the temperature shifts 1 degree past the point of no return. Just 1 degree. But 1 degree was enough. Clara came out of the back room with more bread and looked at the three of them and said with the practical efficiency of a girl who'd grown up in a house where strangers arrived and became family with some regularity, I'll make up the east room. Nora looked at this 16-year-old girl who was already walking back through the kitchen to go prepare a room for her, and something in her face did the thing that faces do when kindness arrives unexpectedly, and all the prepared defenses turn out to be calibrated for something else entirely. Okay, she said, barely above a whisper. Okay. Nora stayed. Not forever. That wasn't how it worked. The ranch was not a place where people came to stay forever. It was a place where people came to stay long enough to remember what solid ground felt like, and then to go build their own. Nora stayed through winter and into spring, and she learned to cook from Rebecca, and to read properly from Clara, and to work horses from Elias, and to fix fence from Daniel, who taught her with the same quiet efficiency he'd been taught. And in April, a letter came from a women's advocacy office in Helena that Pryor had connected them with. And the letter said that the situation in Billings had been addressed and that Nora was legally free. She cried in the kitchen when Rebecca told her, long and hard the way she hadn't let herself cry that first night, and Rebecca sat with her and did not try to make it stop because some things needed to finish on their own. "What do I do now?" Nora said when she was done. "Whatever you want," Rebecca said. "That's the whole point." Nora stayed 2 more months and then took a position in Helena, helping to run a boarding house for young women coming off the stage from the East, women who had left something behind and needed somewhere to land. She wrote to the ranch twice a month, and the letters were practical and funny, and occasionally furious about the injustices she encountered, and Rebecca read every one of them aloud at dinner while her family listened. There were others. There had been others before Nora, and there were others after women and children, and once a man named Garrett, who'd lost his family to typhoid and had been found by Daniel sitting by the road in exactly the posture of a man who has decided to stop. And Daniel had brought him home the way his father had once brought home a widow and 6 starving children, because that was what you did in this family. You brought people home. Elias had held that one together quietly over 6 months of very hard work and had said to Rebecca one evening, "I recognize what he is." "I know," she said. "It takes a long time." "I know that too." He looked at her. "You think he'll make it?" "I think he's here," she said. That's already further than he thought he'd get. Garrett was in Wyoming now, working the copper extraction on Rebecca's land, a foreman's position. Honest work, a wage that was fair, because Rebecca had made sure of it when she'd negotiated the mining contract. He sent a Christmas letter every year. Last year's had included a photograph of himself and a woman named Helen, who he'd met in the spring, and Thomas had looked at the photograph and said with great satisfaction, "Good. He looked too sad for too long." Thomas at 12 had the same gift for plain truth that he'd had at 7, just with more vocabulary. It was a Tuesday evening in late November when Rebecca and Elias drove into Helena for supplies, and she stopped on the sidewalk outside the stage depot. There was a girl, 17 maybe, sitting on a bag outside the depot door with her arms around herself and her head down and her boots worn through at the left heel. Sitting in the last of the light with the particular stillness of someone who has run out of the next move and is waiting for something to happen without knowing what she's waiting for. Rebecca stopped walking. She felt the recognition move through her, the way it always moved through her, fast and complete, the full weight of it arriving all at once. She knew that posture. She had worn that posture. She had been that girl on a frozen road 14 months into the worst stretch of her life, believing, knowing that the world had decided she was too heavy, too broken, too much, and too little, all at the same time. She took one step forward. Elias touched her arm. She stopped, looked at him. He was looking at this girl. And the expression on his face, she had 17 years of reading that face, 17 years of learning the specific language of a man who expressed everything sideways and through his hands, and she read it now the way she read everything. He gave her completely and without effort. He handed her the supply list. "I'll get the wagon brought around," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Elias." "Let me," he said. She stepped back. She watched him cross the street. She watched him approach the girl the way he approached everything that needed careful handling, without rushing, without performance. Measuring the distance and the angle and the weight of the moment, with the precision of a man who had learned the hard way that some things could not be forced, and some doors had to be given time to open. He stopped a few feet from her and stood there, hat in hand, until the girl felt the quiet presence of someone who was not demanding anything, and looked up. Their voices were too low to carry across the street. Rebecca couldn't hear the words, but she saw Elias tilt his head slightly, the way he did when he was listening. She saw the girl's arms tighten around herself, and then slowly release. She saw Elias gesture once toward the wagon, and then she heard it. 4 words, the same 4 words he'd said on a frozen highway on the worst night of her life, arriving across 17 years as clear and plain as the first time. Come with me. Now." The girl looked at him for a long moment. She looked past him at Rebecca standing across the street, and Rebecca held her eyes and nodded once. The way a woman nods when she is telling another woman the thing she cannot say in words. "I have been where you are sitting, and I am telling you this man means exactly what he says." The girl picked up her bag. She stood up. She walked toward the wagon, and Elias fell into step beside her, without touching her, without rushing her at exactly the pace she set. Rebecca watched them come. She thought about a broken cart on a frozen road. She thought about Thomas's lips going gray in the cold. She thought about a rifle in her hands on a burning porch, and the shame that had come up. And then the other thing, the harder thing, the thing that had been there underneath the shame all along, just waiting for the moment when everything else burned away. She thought about Clara's voice saying, "Is it them? Is it the county men, and Daniel's jaw and Joseph's boots, and Elias riding through her gate at a dead gallop, because something of his was on fire, and he'd come back for it." She thought about a courtroom in Missoula, and a judge who'd read a paper trail and understood what it meant. She thought about Thomas at 7 years old, saying, "I'll help too." Like a man accepting a contract because he was 7 years old, and already understood that this was how you survived the world. Not alone, never alone, but together. People choosing each other across the impossible distances that fear and pride and shame build up between human beings. Elias and the girl reached the wagon. Clara had appeared from somewhere. She always appeared when she was needed. Her timing uncanny and deliberate, and was already talking to the girl in the low, easy way she had, asking something practical, something about whether she'd eaten, and the girl was answering. Elias crossed to Rebecca. "Her name's Lucy," he said. "She's from Cheyenne." "How old?" "16. He looked at the girl, and then at Rebecca. "She's got nowhere to go tonight." "She does now," Rebecca said. He looked at her, that look, the one she'd been reading for 17 years, the one that still carried everything she'd first seen in it, on a gray morning at a kitchen table, when he'd told her about Catherine and Alice, and a ranch that had been dying from the inside out. It still carried all of that. It carried all of that, and everything that had come after, and the weight of it was not heavy. The weight of it was the kind of weight that holds you to the earth. "You all right?" he said. "I'm good," she said. "I'm very good." She meant it without reservation, without the complicated footnotes she'd once had to add to every statement about herself. She meant it the way she'd learned to mean things over 17 years of living as exactly who she was. Not smaller, not different, not apologizing for the space she took up in the world, but filling it, all of it, with everything she had. She climbed up onto the wagon beside Clara, and the girl named Lucy and Elias climbed up beside her, and they headed out of Helena toward the ranch in the falling dark, with the mountains rising ahead of them, and the cold air coming down off the peaks, the way it always did in November, like it had something to prove. Thomas would have supper ready. He'd started doing that 6 months ago without being asked. Just started one evening, having the table set and the food warm when they came in. Because he was 12, and he understood with the same plain instinct he'd always had that coming home to a warm table was not a small thing. Daniel would be finishing the fence line and would come in with frozen hands and drink 3 cups of coffee and argue cheerfully with Clara about something that didn't matter. The twins would be teaching Joseph a card game they'd invented that had rules nobody else could follow. The baby, not a baby anymore, 6 years old and ferocious about it, would be trying to convince one of the ranch dogs to sleep in her room. And tomorrow morning, a girl named Lucy from Cheyenne would wake up in the east room and look at the ceiling and hear children's voices and smell coffee and not quite believe yet that it was real. Rebecca had been that girl. She knew exactly what the morning would feel like. She knew what she would say when Lucy came downstairs, uncertain, and braced for the catch for the thing that would be asked in return. She would say what had been said to her in a kitchen on a gray morning 17 years ago, by a man who had been emptied out and was only beginning to understand that emptiness could be filled. She would say, "Pull up a chair. There's coffee, and there's work, and there's no expectation except that you stay as long as you need, and go when you're ready." She would say, "Nobody here is going to ask you to be smaller than you are." She would say, You're safe now. Because that was the thing she'd learned the whole of it. The only thing that mattered when you stripped away the court documents and the mining contracts and the legal arguments and the burning barns. That safety was not given to you by the world. The world was not in the business of giving it. Safety was built board by board, and day by day, by people who had been broken and had chosen against all reasonable calculation to use the broken parts to build something that could hold someone else. You built it and then you opened the door. That was all. That was the whole job. That was the work that never finished and never should. The wagon came through the ranch gate, and Thomas looked up from the porch and raised one hand in greeting, and the dogs came running, and the lights were on in every window, and somewhere inside, Clara had left a pot on the stove because the smell of it came out through the walls and into the cold air, warm and real, and unmistakably, permanently home. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles. Sometimes He sends broken people who decide to stop walking away and in the deciding become exactly the miracle someone else was praying for.